Hi, everyone. Carrie Slattery, Chief Advancement Officer of the Cummer Museum of Art and Gardens. Tonight, I have the great pleasure to introduce Cindy Edelman and Stacey Goldring, presenting their fourth and actually final literature series for this year, Keep Calm and Classically Bound. This series has become so popular, it's become one of our actually signature lecture series for the museum. And next fall, we'll be able to return to an in-person event. If you've not seen Cindy and Stacey live together, you're in for a real treat. I want to thank them both for their wonderful lectures from all of us at the museum, and also their patience presenting the series via Zoom this year. We really appreciate it. So take it away, Cindy and Stacey.
Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you.
If stranded on a desert island, Middlemarch would keep you busy for decades. George Eliot embroiders a story with characters we all know and situations oh so familiar. That's it. 800 pages of people like you and me, minus an iPhone. It doesn't sound like a book that is considered one of the greatest novels of the English language, or as Virginia Woolf put it, one of the first novels for grown-up people. But remember, Woolf wrote a book about the decisions a woman makes while preparing for a dinner party, and thus created an entire new literary genre called stream of consciousness. So Cindy and I trust Virginia. And tonight we present Keep Calm and Classically Bound, featuring William Holman Hunt's Awakening Conscience and George Eliot's Middlemarch. And it is hard to believe, like Carrie said, that we wrap another literature series in partnership with the Cummer. We thank Hannah, Emily, Kara, Brittany, Carrie, and Andrea as we reach this milestone. We have all truly kept calm as we have coped, we hope in past tense, with COVID. We ask that you put your questions in the Q&A as we get started. Have you read Middlemarch?
Yes.
Cindy asked me this question over a year ago. I know you've read Middlemarch.
Well, you were going to kill me. Anyway, go ahead.
It turns out actually neither of us had read it. And in the past, I'd actually written it off as kind of boring. However, Cindy and I were feeling the tightening grip of COVID. And finding comfort in books and literature was a natural coping mechanism for us both. Thus, we trusted our instinct and decided to read it, encouraged by the author's advice. Next slide, Emily. Don't judge a book by its cover.
I thought my mother said that.
Middlemarch's magic lays in its fascinating myriad of interwoven stories of people, as this great cover, next slide please, Emily, shows you that I am not judging a book by its cover, but I love what the artist has done with these profiles because there's a storyline to go with that within the book too. Middlemarchers are humans like you and me who every day face choices that help define their true identity or be smothered by a million ways to hide it. So Middlemarch is our march. So let's meet our main character. Dorothea. Here we find Dorothea living with her young sister and uncle at Tipton Grange. Dorothea, profiled here, is a young woman thirsty for knowledge, but Middlemarch is set in the years of 1829 to 1832, when little education is spent on the weaker sex. The restriction does not quell her passion to learn or make a contribution to society. However, because Dorothea is female, she is crippled by the era's flawed definition, success, and goal of this idea of romantic marriage. And Dorothea has fallen in love with a curmudgeon. You can only imagine where this is going. A few hundred pages later, we're honeymooning in Rome. Next slide, please. It's not exactly a sandals vacation in Jamaica for Dorothea. Here, our disappointed bride, downcast, moping in the Vatican alongside the metaphorical sculpture, the Sleeping Ariadne. Is it Ariadne?
It is, you're right.
Okay. The sculpture is purposefully placed by Eliot, well-versed in the art world, as Cindy will enlighten us later. As a plot device, Eliot lets the reader know that Dorothea's marital malaise is conveyed through the sleeping Ariadne, who represents the conflict of women and natural desire. And it is also a nod to the thickening romantic plot. In a well of light, as you can see, pouring into the museum, Dorothea's beauty is noticed by two artists, one of whom is Dorothea's husband's second cousin, Will, a renegade artist. The palpable attraction between Dorothea and Will causes jealousy in the cadre curmudgeon husband, leading to a codicil that Dorothea, a woman with no legal recourse, leaves her to face painful crossroads. Next slide. Dorothea has been compared to Saint Teresa. Now, as a reader, my hope was that Dorothea could achieve climactical, Bernini-esque ecstatic life. But unfortunately, Dorothea is a self-deprecating woman who, according to our narrator, suffers from marital moral asphyxia, a commentary of a woman's role and identity of the day. So let's leave the love triangle at the Vatican for a moment. Now, I tried to make a chart of Middlemarch so I could keep track of all the stories and characters. And I had an ambitious intention of taking a photograph and then sharing it with Cindy. Next slide. You can see why Cindy never received the photo. The various vortex of intersecting circles populating Middlemarch would take, 26 hours of estimated reading time, let alone our discussion time here this evening. So we'd be here for quite a while. However, we've come up with a clever approach to understand the plot. So I want you to listen to the names as plot clues. You will then have a general idea about the plot and a continuing reinforcement of the story's cautionary tale about ego and identity. So first, let's look at the title of the book, Middlemarch. The word probably conjures subconsciously exactly that, the average go, the acceptable way, perfectly coined to represent the oppressive societal pressures of the times. The story is framed in this fictional place set in the English Midlands, Dorothea's entire world. First and last names. Now, historically, surnames evolved as a way to sort people into groups by occupation, like the Smiths, the Colliers, the Bakers, or place of origin, Michael Scott, or parentage, Dick Van Dyke. Next slide, please. We all know that roses are beautiful, and so does our lovely Rosamond of the Vinceys, a family of social climbers. She is their North Star, confirmed by her best friend, Amir. Whenever evidence goes contrary to her vanity, the theatrical waterworks flow and manipulative minds kick into action. And who is the victim of her strategic charms? Her artfully betrothed, Dr. Tertius Ludgate. His name says it all. Tertius meaning I can't commit. And I think it's Lydgate. Lydgate, well, let's just say that before there was Watergate, we had the poor, tangled troubles of Middlemarch's newest doctor. Dr. Lydgate is not a poster child for courtship or marriage, as you can see here in this illustration. He envisions the role of wife similar to that of a sparkling Christmas ornament. To him, the professional and personal man, he's the entire Christmas tree. But after laying eyes on Rosamond, the lid on that vision is shut. As his name implies, marriage constricts his scientific and medical endeavors and quickly drains his bank account. Lid as in a lid that's shut, and a gate as in a gate that's shut. Rosamond's social climbing parents view the marriage of their spoiled Rose as a way to unload financial debt. George Eliot was no fan of marriage, and further characters utilize this to hide identity and to gain inheritance. Next slide. Next up, Dorothea. Dorothea's younger sister, Celia. She nicknames her older sister, Dorothea, Dodo, referring to the flightless bird inaccurately considered dumb. The author's use of dodo was a direct reference to women of these times whose wings needed to be kept clipped. The Greek etymology reveals blindness, and two sisters do not see eye to eye. Celia cannot fathom the importance Dodo places on education and her rejection of the finer things. However, Celia, as her name implies, never wants to see anyone hurt. Her instincts are on point when she cautions Dodo against marrying the older, soup-slurping curmudgeon of an old man named Casaubon. Next slide, please. George Eliot probably invoked the name Casaubon as a reference to scholars by the same name who studied Greek classics, as Eliot did. Here, Edward Casaubon is a pompous, sexually repressed portrait of failure to launch, bent on writing a book that will stun the world, entitled The Key to All Mythologies. Don't we all know egoic bloviators like Casaubon who think they have all the answers? My favorite character, maven of Middlemarch gossip, Mrs. Cowwater, sees right through the sky, referring to his blood, quote, if somebody put a drop under a magnifying glass and they saw it was all semicolons and parentheses. I could have shut the book right there. I've been done and very happy. Anyway, Casaubon's stately manner is named Lowick. No wonder this non-emotive Casanova lives at Lowick. This milquetoast guy only wants Dorothea as a secretary and maid to, quote, rub his pier glass or extensive surface of polished steel. I know you love that. Just makes you so happy.
I just can't help it. You're just too funny.
Oh,
That's
my
all
gosh.
there is.
Okay. So contrast Mr. Krabby to his nephew, Will, who describes himself as an unfettered Pegasus, like out of a Harlequin novel, right? Because he takes great risks and his lifestyle stands as a slap in the face to the staid older cousin. Will is always associated throughout the book with sunlight and openness. Moving from one frigid gent to another, next slide, let's introduce the miserly Peter Featherstone. Our narrator calls him a, quote, Christian Casanova, unquote. What clues do we have about this gentleman? Well, just as St. Peter stands in judgment at the pearly gates, we tune in to the English countryside with Peter Featherstone at the cusp of his departure from this world at Stone Court. He judges from his death feather bed who should inherit his estate. His standards for inheritance always changing, rising high like a feather in the air to low like a stone sinking to the bottom. So no one knows where they stand. Featherstone's entire family sits in wait in his grand home, listening and counting the minutes until he expires, like koi in a pond, hoping to be fed. Also at Stone Court, the lowly yet literary Mary Garth, the caregiver responsible for Peter Featherstone from bedpan to plate, but also relegated to feeding the entire vulturous Featherstone clan. Eliot sets a trap for anyone who may inherit, including an outsider, a nouveau riche unknown, Mr. Nicholas Bulstrode. Next slide. It wasn't until I moved to Jacksonville where I was introduced to the terms my people and our people. Now, with time and a little bit of dissociation, I better understood these concepts, this tribal connection that we all share as a way of self-preservation. Middlemarchers logically only trust their people. George Eliot offers up a very shrewd character who acts as a methodical bull in the china shop. Eliot's Mr. Nicholas Bulstrode strides in to Middlemarch, marrying into the right family. His wife, Harriet, nee Vincy, Rosamond's aunt. His provenance is unknown, but trappings of wealth work just as well then as they do now, casting a brain fog elixir on these people. This wafty aura excuses his bad bullying and manipulative behavior. It mutes logical suspicion. Bulstrode rules with weapons of righteousness, religious dogma, and judgmental errors, all soaked and cloaked in piety and wealth. So even though his past is shady, he's accepted. Like I said, Middlemarch reflects all of us. Peppered elsewhere are more characters whose names also reveal plot. The self-effacing vicar fair brother, equally at home, addressing the pews as pints in the pub. Lowest on the social rung of society, the Garth family. Servants, caretakers, owners of little, and as their name indicates from the Middle English, Garth means land. Next slide. So let's go big picture. Do you see the ladder that is near the wrist? Welcome to Freshet Hall. This is the pulse, or depending how you interpret Freshet. This is home to the family, a family who is convincing themselves or others that they are politically correct, suspicious of the right things, very fashionable, and oh so fresh. Clearly, this is the home of the Vinceys. Now, if you look to the lower left, you'll see a book, an orange book. This is where Dorothea lives, at Tipton Court. Her quest for love and meaning in life are tipped in a balance. Now, stuck in the middle, the farmer, the poor Garth family, trying to stay afloat on manual labor and trust. And of course, the upper class Casaubon at Lowick Manor go way up by the thumb. It's just a black hole of stale inertia where good ideas come to die. And then way over near the pinky, way over there, stands a little red X. Well, X equals unknown. Here, represented by a hospital. I'm not kidding. A sign of the future, an unknown new science. It would be like if Tesla just opened up in St. Johns County. It's progress with all its implications. With all these established points on the map, add the churches and the pubs, all these characters pass through, testing their egos, challenging their perceptions of life at a time when England was on the verge of massive change. I'd argue we've reached that same intersection today. By way of biographical detective work, now let's look behind the name of George Eliot. Next slide. Is it any coincidence that even our author's name has great meaning? She was born Mary Ann Evans, 1819, in the middle of England. But she went by the nickname of Polly, and she was aware from an early age that being female and intelligent were liabilities. Atonement could only be partially made by arranged marriages. Polly knew she was not a worthy candidate for any marriage, being a voracious reader and independent thinker. Plus, she didn't have good looks. So early in life, she is being exposed to a good education, the benefits of inherited wealth, and seeing the inequities of the poor. The more educated she became, the more she sheds her strict Anglican upbringing, eventually rejecting religion and marriage. All of this knowledge is reflected in her novels by allusion, metaphor, plot, and critique and motif. Next slide, please. Now 30 years old, she leaves the countryside and goes to London. There she becomes Mary Ann, and throughout her life, how she spelled Mary Ann would vary. We see Mary Ann Evans in London like Mary Tyler Moore in Chicago. In the big city, Mary Ann's conscience awakens. The word awake has been used for centuries in cultural and personal terms. It's nothing new. And our Mary Ann has tapped into her own, writing about the social inequities of her times, getting published, her wages and inheritance, making her independent. Mary Ann rises to the role of a Lou Grant. She's an editor of a free-thinking journal. She could never have her name and title published because in the 1800s, a respectable woman was not an editor, period. Being published, though, allowed her to criticize the drivel printed for women readers. She called these novels frothy, dangerous, and silly. As seen as in one of her published articles, where you can see the arrow, she wrote something called Silly Novels by Lady Novelists. Why were they dangerous? Because every message was to achieve marriage, and education was seen to be a detriment. Mary Ann was disgusted. And who likes a mouthy woman who doesn't know her place? What was going on in the world anyway? Mary Ann Evans was speaking about a major issue in the 19th century, next slide please, called the woman question. All female Middlemarchers lived in a world that asks, was a woman a whole thinking being or just a satellite of a man? Could she obtain a divorce? Did she have a soul? Did she deserve an education, independence, a right to vote? God forbid, dally in real estate. Let's take Dorothea. She experiences how estate law hamstrings her future. I'm referring to primogeniture. The entire premise of Downton Abbey is based on this. Remember cousin Matthew, the male who inherits the estate, not Mary? Well, that's because the law dictates that the family's firstborn male inherits everything and assures familial representation in the House of Lords. I would call it the Our People principle. Look around your local communities. The relevance to Middlemarch, crystal clear. This is the world that produces Middlemarch. Our authors love life. It's interesting, but we don't have time to go into it. She was convinced she'd lead an unknown life until she met what was considered the ugliest man in England. Next slide, George Lewis. He becomes her partner and agent. He's a little bit married, but that doesn't stop them. They move in together. They defy the entire Victorian moral code and they move in together. And eventually, Mary awakens to fiction. However, she, like Bronte, dons a nom de plume, determined to write a new kind of novel, a novel that addresses the restrictive world of women, novels with no happy endings. Mary adapts George because George is the love of her life, and Eliot because, depending on your source, it either sounds like a good mouthful or she just saw it on a map in her dad's office as a young girl. Her success was swift with her first novel in 1859. Although Mary's identity was actually revealed, she kept the name George Eliot. Why? It became a brand. It offered her the protection from those who insisted that she take a more active role in reform. George Lewis was able to market her as a writer above the political chatter. The result? Next slide, please. 7 amazing novels and other essays and translations. And I'd like to call particular attention to her last novel, Daniel Deronda, which was published in 1876. This is one of these books I picked up years ago, and I couldn't believe the plot. It talks about the establishment of a Jewish state. This is in the 1800s, and Theodor Herzl and Zionism feature. I had no idea. You know what? I admire this businesswoman who artfully protected her image and her books and her work. She does not offer radical or wild solutions for women in her novels because, you know what? That'd be too easy. So, dear listener, By the end of Middlemarch, George Eliot has given us a first-hand account of the struggles of women and the radical changes in politics and culture. And wait for it. This novel, written in 1870, lays out the vital role of public health for the welfare of all Middlemarchers, ipso facto England. Next slide, please. I am not making this up. Last summer, when I read this novel, I was shocked. Oh, go to the slide, go one slide back. I was shocked by the relevant conversations had in Middlemarch. Just go to one more slide back or two more slides back. Thank you. While we were, sorry, okay. We'll wait for her to catch up. That's okay. While we're waiting to get back to the cover that has the mask on it, right there, wonderful. While we were reading Middlemarch, there was a looming pandemic. Well, there was in Middlemarch as well. As one worried Middlemarcher exclaimed, quote, "Oxygen, nobody even knows what that is. And maybe yet there are people who say quarantine is no good," unquote. Between the quack doctors, the suspicious patients, scared politicians, and earnest folks, worry spread and debate ensued. Public health, hospitals, the role of government, private enterprise, and you know what? Every Middlemarcher thought they were right. So just exchange COVID for cholera. This is a cautionary tale. All of these issues written by an author who was super smart, almost a polymath, and yet I have no time to mention her love of math or her love of Spinoza. Mary Ann Evans' life, like her books, does not end neatly like an Amour's novel, like an Amour Toll's novel certainly does. In 1878, after her beloved George Lewis dies, she gets married again a few months later to a much younger man. She gets married. Anyway, it only lasts 2 years because she passes on, but her lessons live on. Her novels presented a 19th century collision that's still relevant today. No wonder Middlemarch is over 800 pages. And if that is not enough, if you could go to my last slide, here is a sampling of the wonderful mouthfuls of her lexiconic cacophony. Next slide. Cindy and I created LiterARTure because art and literature can bridge understanding of one another, despite raging rivers of divisive politics, streams of lies, and deep puddles of paranoia. And what is our evidence that this is true? Open Middlemarch, page 1, chapter 1, the first sentence. We see a young woman who is described as reminiscent of Italian paintings depicting the Blessed Virgin. And what is her name? Miss Dorothea Brooke. It is with great pleasure that I present my dear friend and incredible art lecturer, the very patient Cindy Edelman, to awaken our conscience and further connect our understanding of the human condition with William Holman Hunt's Awakening Conscience.
Mwah. Stacey, you never fail to be intellectual, enlightening, and humorous all at the same time. And I have to say, you made me want to reread Middlemarch, even though it took me all summer long.
Good, don't watch the BBC because it's horrible.
Oh, I agree, that was terrible. I've been reflecting on this season's LiterARTure's art component, and there seems to be a recurring theme, which in retrospect was unintentional. The nightmare, the symphony in white, the white girl, and now this evening, the awakening conscience, all represent Victorian women. And please move us to the next slide. Emily, thank you. Fuseli was a little bit ahead of Victorian era, but okay, you can indulge me that 50 years. So all these Victorian women really have a whole heap of troubles, including bad dreams, poverty, modeling for men who use them as sexual objects. Okay, we know it couldn't have been easy being a woman in the 19th century, especially naive country women from working class slums of London, like our barmaid, Annie Miller, in tonight's work on the right. Women who fled the countryside to find husbands or employment during the rise of the Industrial Revolution and the tremendous growth of cities. Like Annie Miller in tonight's painting, one of the reasons the theme of fallen women was popular at this time was due to the fact that it echoed the prevalence of prostitution in the Victorian age. So during the 19th century, men and women's roles were being redefined. And in England, such women who were known as fallen women, were described as problem women. Why problems? Well, they had no husband, they had no father, they had no brother to protect them. And such women almost always experienced really horrible consequences, resulting in being ostracized or suffering or dying prematurely, even many by suicide. Needless to say, there was no Me Too movement in the 19th century. Speaking of Me Too, I've done some non-scientific polling, posing the following question to family and friends. Who, in your opinion, is an example of a contemporary fallen woman? And without exception, all polled, all 5 of them, mentioned Monica Lewinsky, who has been described as a bimbo, a stalker, a seductress. And she was 22 at the time of the infamous rendezvous with President Bill Clinton. Well, what a difference 23 years makes. Considering Monica in today's context, well, her history has been rewritten. Initially called a slut, etc., now she is seen as the victim. This one-time so-called vixen has rehabilitated her life, becoming an outspoken critic, an outspoken anti-cyberbullying advocate. And as a result, many of her harshest critics have confessed their bias. She used this truly awful life-altering experience to create a platform for good. She may have once been the fallen woman, but in many ways is like a phoenix, and she's had her vindication. Next slide, please. Before we get into the painting, and there's much to dissect, allow me to introduce the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, or as we move ahead, I'm just going to refer to them as the PRB. This is the band of brothers known as rebels who were determined to reform the artistic establishment, AKA the Royal Academy. And we've talked about the Royal Academy already in these lectures. The Royal Academy's rules and works were deemed stuffy, irrelevant, unmoving, and false by these 3 gentlemen who thought that art was too commercial and too conventional. And it was initially founded in 1848 by these 3 men who met. They actually attended the Royal Academy as students. But they include our artists tonight, William Holman Hunt, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and John Everett Millay. Isn't it funny that they all have 3 names? I just love that fact about them. So these gentlemen advocated for bright colors that were found in 15th century Italian and Northern European Renaissance paintings, works that were made prior to the time of the great genius, the high Renaissance painter Raphael. They also loved complex compositions and those that were full of detail and symbolic meaning. And they also liked literary subjects. One of them, Millay, painted the drowning of Ophelia. And I'm sure a lot of you are aware of that picture. But fictional, historical, and literary subjects with a heavy dose of illusion. Next, please. For you art history nerds, and I know you're out there, why Raphael? And this particular slide is in honor of my dear co-associate, my colleague, Stacey. Why Raphael? At the time, so this is the 19th century now, Raphael was considered by critics to be the greatest painter who lived. And I don't have time to take exception at that now, except maybe at another date. We'll put that in the parking lot. The PRB thought him to be the apex of academic art. And these painters didn't want to follow the rigid rules or imitate works that they felt didn't speak to the time. They wanted to paint works that were relevant. So initially, the PRB determined to be a secret group, inscribing their paintings with the monogram PRB. And that, of course, intrigued the critics and patrons, causing some to say that the letters stood for "Please ring bell," or preferably rich buyers. But by 1850, their identity had been discovered. So you see on the screen here, Raphael's School of Athens, a zenith of 16th century high Renaissance mastery, showing a cavalcade of great thinkers and scientists. And it was a return to classical antiquity, perfectly proportioned figures, elegant figures, linear perspective to the ultimate linear perspective, harmony and balance rule the land. And compare that to the Marode altarpiece from the workshop of Robert Campen, which was a 15th century Northern altarpiece, which, by the way, if you go to New York and you're so inclined, you want to see this because it's such a special work of art, you can see it at the Cloisters, which is part of the Metropolitan Museum. And so you see the Marode altarpiece that's just so full. There's so much symbolism it would make your hair stand up. And so much detail, everything from the moment that the angel Gabriel is informing Mary, who's so learned, she's so humble, she's sitting on the floor reading scripture. And you unfortunately, you aren't able to see this on the slide, but there's like a little spiritual figure who really comes through, who breaks the glass and comes through to the Holy Spirit, who's going to carry the Christ child into Mary's womb. And there's so much more to unpack, but we have to time travel to the 19th century. Next, please. Needless to say, the PRB were not favored by the Royal Academy. That's an understatement. And it took quite a bit of persuasion by the great art critic, John Ruskin. Remember, he was the same person that Whistler sued for libel when we were talking about the white girl and art for art's sake. Ruskin's defense of the pre-Raphaelites elevated their work and playing a major role in their acceptance. Like the poet Baudelaire, the French poet who spoke to the French Impressionist painters, urging them to paint modern life, Ruskin told the PRBs to go to nature, which he thought was far superior to the materialism and the ugliness of the industrial world. He also encouraged them to paint from their imagination. You're looking at a portrait by Millet of Ruskin. By the way, those are Ruskin's dates on the slide, not Millet's. And then a photo of Ruskin and Hunt in their later years. They both had great beards. The two men were friends, Ruskin and Hunt. And although we don't have time tonight to dig deeper, both gentlemen had a considerable impact on George Eliot and her aesthetic sensibility. Ruskin introduced Hunt to Eliot, and in fact, she knew all the pre-Raphaelites. And there are many art-related references in Middlemarch. Stacey's touched on the Hellenistic sleeping Ariadne. My favorite art scene I want to share, it's when the artistically naive Dorothea Brooke is on her disastrous honeymoon, forced to tour the Vatican Museum, which, there must be, 20 miles of, worth of art in the Vatican Museum on her own. Of course, she would have seen, a number of Raphaels, which would have been nice. And there she is observed by Will Ladislaw. Stacey's already described who he is, and his teacher, Adolf Naumann, who are wildly enthusiastic over Dorothea's voice and her beauty and her pose, pronouncing her more beautiful than the elegant Ariadne. Now, as a reader, we feel such angst for her terrible choices, like marrying the curmudgeonly, and we use the word separately. We've never used that word so many times in a talk. The curmudgeonly Casaubon, who breaks her heart and crushes her soul, but we're cheered to know that someone else finds her and accepts her for who she is and finds her worthy of friendship. Eliot scholar Joseph Wiesenfarth maintains, quote, Dorothea's unresponsiveness in art points not so much to her own ignorance as to the failure of other characters and of society to accomplish the aims of true art. True art lies in a portrayal of nature and of society that translates nature and society faithfully. I thought that was such a beautiful description of her, because she was longing to be learned. And, the fact that she hadn't been exposed to a lot of art wasn't her fault. And I bring this up to say that Hunt would also carry this philosophy into his work. Next slide, please. Born in London in 1827, Hunt started his artistic career at the age of 18 when he entered the Royal Academy. And after meeting Millet and Rossetti, became the PRB. And he, of all the PRB, and eventually there were at least 13 or so artists who joined the PRB. It was short-lived. It only was about 5 years. It only lasted about 5 years as a group. But Hunt was the one who really was the most consistent, because he kept painting it. His attention to detail and his elaborate symbolism, along with his deeply felt faith, really kept him in good stead throughout his long career. He lived till he was 83. And he was also very dedicated to his Protestant evangelical faith. And that is seen by the fact that he insisted on going to the Holy Land so he could paint it with honesty and authenticity. He was hugely influenced by Ruskin, who made a case for Christian art's transactional power. Hunt addressed key issues in Victorian art and faith by showing a lot of people having conversions or illuminations, implying that art, had a key role in generating Christian beliefs. At the end of his life, Hunt wrote this, quote, "My desire was to show how the still small voice speaks to a human soul in the turmoil of life," end quote. He passed away at 83 in 1910. And of all places, he's buried at Sir Christopher Wren's St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Now, the artist's deep religious feeling was expressed in the painting on the right, entitled "The Light of the World," which was painted just before the Awakening Conscience on the left. And The Light of the World shows his deep religious feeling. It shows a wood scene of Christ coming to a door with no handle, and it was taken from the Book of Revelation and painted as a companion piece to the Awakening Conscience. Well, what do we have here? We have two paintings illustrating similar moments of illumination in allowing us to perceive the event from two different perspectives or lenses, one from the vantage point of eternity, the work on the right, and a second from a more specific historical moment. And I'm sorry we don't have more time to dive into The Light of the World. So in the next few slides, we're going to look at what influenced Hunt directly prior to painting The Awakening Conscience. Next, please. The late, great art historian, Linda Nochlin. One more, please, Emily. Thank you. The late, great Linda Nochlin, she of Why Aren't There Any Great Women Artists, maintained that it was a Rossetti drawing that actually influenced Hunt to paint The Awakening Conscience. You see on the left this drawing. It's a busy scene that was taken from a play. It was based on a play about a dissolute nobleman, his reckless relationship with a young woman of lower social standing. And it's set inside a tent at dawn after a night of too much fun. And you see bookending the drawing on the left is a child who is playing a lute with her eyes closed. She could be just standing up, sleeping. And on the right is a hairy ape who's scratching himself. It's so disgusting. And Stacey remarked when we were going through this, she thought that it reminded her of the incubus from The Nightmare. They represent symbols. The child is innocence. The hairy ape is depravity rather. And the name Hesterna rosa is Latin for yesterday's rose, and it refers to the young woman who, I don't think we identified her, but she is she's sitting on the sofa. She's on the left side, and her head is resting on her arm, and Rossetti drew the moment when this young woman stopped to reflect on her life's path and the wisdom of her choices. And this is just one of many examples of fallen women that the PRBs were obsessed with. And according to Nochlin, like the awakening conscience, the Hesterna Rosa shows the power of music to awaken the conscience by recalling one's childhood innocence. And the similarities between these two works are really striking, including the use of the window that focused on nature and the morning's early light coming through that window, the close quarters that are seeming claustrophobic, creepy animals, and the heavy heart of the kept woman. Next, please. Now, this is one of the most famous and important works of all of art history, the Arnolfini portrait by the Bruges-based artist and innovator Jan van Eyck. And this historically, besides the fact that it's just this masterpiece of symbolism and detail and illusion and of the time, it entered the National Gallery of London when the pre-Raphaelites were studying art, and they would have swooned over and over after seeing it. And what we have here are a couple from Lucca, the Italians who were working in the North, Nicolai and Giovanna Arnolfini. They were standing in their prosperous living room. You may wonder, scratching your head, what is she talking about? There's a bed. Well, a bed was a symbol of wealth and prosperity. And so, of course, you'd want to have your bed inside this space and to show your wealth and status. The space was also teeming with objects, including a window to the outside with a teeny tiny cherry tree painted on the right-hand side. Van Eyck's convex mirror must have struck Hunt as a way of compressing and expanding space. And by the way, these paintings are almost exactly the same size. The Van Eyck is 30 by 24 inches, and the Awakening Conscience is the Van Eyck is 30 by 24, and the Awakening Conscience is 30 by 22. So they're almost, identical. There's much to unpack in the mirror, going back to the Van Eyck here. There are small medallions set within the frame of the mirror that include some of the stations of the cross. They're inscribed, indicating also the religious nature of the painting. And there's way more religious subjects here, or symbols. And there are also the reflections in the mirror. It's a very small mirror. And including Van Eyck's signature above the mirror, indicating his authorship of this painting. And if that doesn't razzle dazzle you, there are 4 human figures reflected in the mirror. Each artist uses different contrasting textures. Van Eyck was a master's master when it came to expressing the fur coat on Nicolai, or Giovanni's very heavy green dress. In any case, you can see how much Hunt gleaned from the painting. As to the meaning of the Arnolfini, we'll have to save that for another day. Can we go to the next, please? Then we see in the next slide the brilliant 18th century British satirist William Hogarth, who blasted upper class and aristocratic audiences with the notion of conspicuous consumption. He had such an unusual working method. He would make a series of paintings in a sequence, like chapters in a good book or scenes in a play, that would follow a character or characters that he would then turn into engravings and sell multiple copies. I mean, a guy had to make a living, right? This one is called, this is from the series Marriage a la Mode, created in 1745. And this is the second in the tale of this wanton couple whose greedy parents forced them into marriage. They had no interest in one another. The the guy, I won't even call him a gentleman. He's been out all night carousing. There are a pair of women's undies in his pocket that the little dog is trying to get at. And of course, on his neck, he's got a big black syphilitic ID. And he's been out all night. It's 12 noon. We know that because there's a clock here. Please don't let me go on and on about this work. And then his wife, whose father had lots of money, and this guy's name is Viscount Squanderfield. Squanderfield's father needed cash, and so that's how they were linked. They had an arranged marriage. Once they were married, everything goes terribly wrong. Boredom, adultery, visits to quacks, all ending in tragedy, not to mention horrible cases of syphilis, even beyond him. Like Hunt, Hogarth loved moral subjects. Both show aristocratic men taking advantage of women from different classes. Hogarth demonstrated that it was really important for contemporary moral subjects to be considered, especially from his very shrewd satirical lens. And finally, in the influence department, please, next slide, Emily. We see an engraving by the great German artist Albert Dürer that's entitled "Young Woman Attacked by Death." And Hunt liked this because, in his view, the seducer is an embodiment of death from whose arms the young woman must struggle to get out of to reach Christ and a new life. So next, please. We've set the stage for this painting, AKA psychological drama that fascinated the public. It's time to dive in. And so where are we, and are you experiencing claustrophobia yet? So from the Tate Museum, where it lives, we know that the location of the painting is a room in a villa in St. John's Wood in London, and any upper class Victorian or aristocrat would have known the setting. It was called a maison du convenant, and it's an example of a kind of abode where men kept women who weren't their wives. That's a nice way of putting it, isn't it?
Very nice.
So right off the bat, we learn that this is a temporary space, a superficial one. Everything in the setting is in disarray, disorder reigns. The notion of extreme clutter, rich fabrics, fringe, and the lack of modesty really scream moral confusion. Ruskin had plenty to say about this painting, calling the setting, quote, having fatal newness, end quote, fatal newness. Nothing was worn, nothing was used, nothing was frayed. New here suggests falseness, and the colors in general are garish and gaudy. Next, please. Oh, you really did a job on that cat.
Thank you very much.
Looking closely, the only sign of domesticity, true domesticity here, lies below the table, is this giant, well-fed cat. And it's quite an aggressive feline. It's depicted torturing a bird with a broken wing. And it's no accident that the cat's pose mimics the man's who's sitting at the piano, clutching his catch, so to speak. And it's poised, the cat is poised to devour the poor bird like the philandering pianist is going to use the young woman. And catch the cat's look. It looks as though the cat has been interrupted by the music that the guy is playing with his left hand. Next, please. Moving along, we see a discarded glove on the floor in front of the young woman, primarily interpreted as a sign of her fate that's going to happen, what that will become her fate once her benefactor grows tired of her. And then, like resting on the floor and then a little on the piano, you see a tangled skein of yarn that represents the web in which she is ensnared. And with regard to her hem, Ruskin wrote this to the London Times in defense of this painting in 1854. The very hem of the poor girl's dressing gown, at which the painter has labored so closely, thread by thread, has a story in it if we think how soon its pure whiteness may be soiled with dust and rain, her outcast feet failing in the street. Thanks to Stacey, we notice the hem features a heart-shaped design, which it's just really so, it's just so perfect for this painter. Next, please. The Victorian viewer would have immediately understood that this was a private moment by the young woman's appearance, wearing a white dressing gown that would have screamed inappropriate in a middle-class home. Our heroine is also covered her lower half with a paisley shawl that's crudely wrapped, giving off this vibe of false modesty. And as though that were not enough, it was scandalous that she wasn't wearing a corset. Now, to our eyes, our 21st century eyes, we can hardly tell, but that's what the scholars have discerned. And she is seen with disheveled hair. Her hair is loose around her back, a telltale sign of casualness. Any self-respecting aristocrat would never have appeared like that, even in the parlor, especially in the parlor of one's home. You never know where you're going to get company. So we are walking into this intimate moment between what has been described as, it's such a great term, asymmetrical intimacy. Asymmetrical intimacy. Do you want to talk about that? I know you can't help it. Okay. She is dependent on him, and he would likely abandon her whenever he was ready. Her pose is awkward, suspended between standing and sitting. Her hands are tightly clasped as in prayer. Notice that she wears rings on all her fingers, but on her left hand, but her ring finger. And in this claustrophobic, gaudy room, we discern that she is a kept woman, a mistress. I really dislike using the word mistress, but that's how she's been described all these years, due to the absence of a wedding ring. And you've got the gentleman, nicely dressed, wearing outdoor clothes, sits at the highly polished piano. He's got a lascivious kind of affect. He's playing the piano one-handed, as I mentioned, and they're singing a song. And because the music is so clearly portrayed, they're singing a Thomas More's popular Irish song, "Oft in the Stilly Night." And it is at this very moment of recognition of the lyrics that cause the young woman to pause, as though she's hearing something that she's heard before, reminding her of her past and her home and her loved ones. And, they were very interested in memory at this time in the 19th century, and especially how is it that past experiences can revisit you in the present. And certainly Hunt was aware that one of the most powerful triggers of memory was music. And so he imagined that this Irish tune had suddenly taken this girl back to her parents and her family and her home. And it's no accident that the tune, the lyrics in the tune, are about memories. So this is the essence of what Hunt was after in painting the scene, the exact time when she would rise up from his lap at the moment of her reflection on her former existence. And she rises according to a scholar, a very famous scholar, a writer of one of the 19th century books in the 19th century, Robert Rosenblum, who says this, that, quote, she rises with a slow but burning revelation that she's been trapped in a material world of moral evil. And so in that one, end quote, in that one memory, she becomes transformed. In this scene, Hunt shows how God can come to us in unexpected moments. And I suspect that we all have experienced those moments when God has come to us, most likely not sitting on someone's lap, and in this particular context. So as she gets up, she stares into an open window. The opening, she needs to escape her captor. And what does she do? What does she see when she looks out the window? She sees a garden with beautiful light and trees and leaves and sunshine. And it's all reflected in the mirror behind her. And the Garden of Eden was not far from his thoughts. Like Van Eyck, Hunt used a mirror to tell a story, and a powerful story. And here the mirror represents the woman's lost innocence. However, redemption is indicated by the ray of light in the foreground of the picture, and that redemption is within reach. And I watched a couple of videos that a Tate curator gave about this painting, and it's because this is just an example. What I'm sharing is just an example that you can't always look at a work of art on a slide or on the internet and assume you can get everything about it, because she was saying that the back of the painting, that the majority of the painting is shadowy, but the very front is, there's like this this triangle of light at the moment that she's standing up and realizing her future is not doomed. That is really what the artist was after. And we can see how intensely her salvation was felt. Her eyes are tear stained, and her stare certainly gives it away. But as an aside, the original expression of this model was much more agonized and apparently difficult. And the gentleman who bought this painting asked Hunt to repaint the model's face because he didn't like the expression on the original expression. And so he did. So I want to just, how much time do I have?
You're fine. Just keep going.
Okay. The room itself can be read as an embodiment of her morality. How do we know this? Because let's see, can we go to the next slide? Yes, thank you so much, Emily. And you all can read the proverbs that Hunt would have had etched on the base of the frame. And I don't know how clear, this was the best version of this frame painting I could find, but I want to just say that Hunt designed the border of the frame where we find bells standing for warning, marigolds standing for sorrow or symbolizing sorrow, and the star, which would be a sign of or a symbol of spiritual revelation. And I just want to say this too, that this was a radical painting for its time, as intimacy of this kind was seen in like ancient art or literary stories, but not of the ones that were actually real or true that you would see in modern life. And so this work really becomes a contrast between the immoral behavior of both aristocrats and working class against the virtuous behavior of the middle class. And let's go to the next slide, please. And so our painting also tells another story, an unrequited love story between Hunt, the painter, and the model, the gorgeous, luminous, just beautiful Annie Miller. Hunt met Annie Miller. You see a photo of her on the left, and then a portrait by Rossetti of her as, Helen of Troy. So this is Rossetti's vision of Helen of Troy in Annie. And so Hunt met her in a London pub when she was 15 years old. She was a barmaid. And he attempted to be Henry Higgins to her Eliza Doolittle, or Pygmalion, whichever you prefer. He wanted to turn her into a lady because he was in love with her. Regrettably, her feelings were not returned. And so he found her good lodgings. He found her with a nice landlady. He bought her a wardrobe, and he arranged for her access to schooling. And this painting was painted in 1853, and he left soon after and it was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1854. And then he left immediately after to go to the Holy Land, and he left, and she was pretty much exclusively, he thought that they were further along in their relationship than apparently she did. And he left a list of male artists that she could pose for in his absence. And he gave it to one of his closest buddies, a pre-Raphaelite. And he specifically told Frederick Stevens that he could not let Annie pose for Rossetti. Well, that went out the window. I mean, apparently Annie had a very strong mind of her own. She became a successful model, and she also had a relationship with a viscount or a peer for a while, and ended up marrying one of his cousins and had a very successful marriage and lived to be 90 years old. So just wanted to just show one more little detail that Stacey kindly through the table in there, which is to the right of the painting of Annie. This is from The Awakening Conscience, where there's a rosewood table that Hunt painted, and there was a writing manual on the table, a book teaching to teach adults how to write. And apparently Annie was not interested in learning how to write. She had other ideas, and she broke off her relationship with Hunt, and the rest is history. And I guess what I wanted to make, and one of my final points, yes, there is an end to this, she escaped the narrative written for her. And certainly many critics see this painting as the story of Hunt's unrequited love for her. And we are going to show you some of the other slides. The following slides illustrate other examples of fallen women. And we'll just, if Emily wants to just click right now, do you want to say anything about these or not? I mean, these were painted around the same time as Hunt, and they show you this obsession that artists, even artists other than pre-Raphaelites, were showing how horrible it was for young women who, unfortunately, due to circumstances probably mostly beyond their control, like this young woman's, had a baby out of wedlock, and her father's throwing her out in the snow. Okay, I really don't have time to talk about all these. I just want to run through them. Can you go to the next? And then this is a part of a triptych called Past and Present, where a woman is impregnated by another man, and her husband is throwing her out, and she has to give up her children, and she's just completely. She has the baby, and in the final slide, it's just tragic, just so tragic. And then here's one that has committed suicide by drowning.
And this was common.
And then let's see. This is by Rossetti, and this was early. It took him, he worked on this a long time. This one is called Found, that represents a drover. That is someone who, would bring in the livestock to market. And you can see in the back, there's a calf that's ensnared in a net. And he sees this woman by a wall, and it turns out he knows her. He knew her. He had been in love with her, and she had turned to prostitution. It's just, again, these are just so utterly painful. And then this is an unfinished work by a later painter, a later pre-Raphaelite, Ford Madox Brown, and that's his wife posing, and they had lost a child, and it's entitled "Take Your Son, Sir." And again, your heart breaks for these. So we hope you enjoyed our presentation tonight. We've really enjoyed our partnership with the Cummer. We thank them. We thank them for allowing us this platform to talk about art and literature. I also would like to say that searching for identity means a great deal to me, especially its mission. And I hope that all of you all will become familiar with the work that Searching for Identity does. And this LiterARTure is just one of the parts of Searching for Identity. And we have some exciting plans for LiterARTure, which I'm going to turn it back over to Stacey, and she's going to share.
I could listen to you all night.
Likewise, you make me laugh.
I mean, let me tell you something. The thing that is so amazing is everything that Cindy spoke about, all those details on the paintings, they could be their own talk in themselves. So every painting that you have seen, Cindy could give an entire series, just like on the Van Eyck.
Well, the Van Eyck, we could have spent our 2 hours on half of the 2 hours.
But the themes, how they converge about all these women not being able to get out, they can't get out of the way of society. And thank God for the PRB, who finally said, look, look, you can't look away anymore.
Right, but I think it took a long time before they got some rights. Right.
Yes,
but I do think the detail in the book, the detail in Middlemarch, the detail in these paintings. What were these
Well, they were
It just
playing
is-
on their phone. I mean, they had bigger brains. I mean, it just
Oh,
seems
they were
like
just so,
they could focus. I think it's a result of being able to
and
focus.
no distractions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like we have now.
Yeah.
You know, some of us have ADHD.
Yeah.
Okay.
We
That
got
being
that.
said, that was outstanding,
Oh,
and I
thank you.
just have to.
Oh, I love you.
Okay, so we want to wrap it up tonight by letting you know, like Cindy said, that LiterARTure is a searching for identity program, and LiterARTure is a nonprofit dedicated to dynamic programming and capturing stories based on the written word, stories that must be told. And we, like Carrie said, we look to the fall for another great year of stories with you.
And if you have
in
any
person.
suggestions.
Oh,
Okay.
I wrote it. We rehearsed it. I had all
Okay. Sorry.
Take two. Okay, so moving forward, we want to hear from you, right? That's what you're trying, right? So if you have artwork that you'd like to explore, if there's something particular, maybe even at the Comer that speaks to you and you want to know more, we've got an expert right here.
No, especially at the Comer. We would love to
Oh my
know.
gosh. Yes, absolutely. And if you want to have deeper conversations about art, deeper conversations about books, or are interested in a writing workshop about your own identity, I urge you to support our mission and to check us out at info@searchingforidentity.org. A little tired.
Lisa, don't kill her.
Yeah, sorry, Lisa. Mess that up. Because we want to hear from you. And we look forward to this two-way conversation because I'm a little bit looking at books and Beautiful Cindy, which I love, but we would also want to, we want to interact with you again. We want to get out there in person.
Wait.
Right?
Can't wait.
So cheers. Thank you to the Comer. Thank you so much and have a very safe summer and we'll see you in the fall. Thank you.
Thank you.